It is my distinct honor to introduce today's keynote. Few people can say that they have sat across from the negotiating table from Iran or North Korea. Ambassador Wendy Sherman has done both. Originally a social worker, she began her career working to help battered women and the urban poor. Today, Ambassador Sherman is a professor of the practice of public leadership and director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. In addition, she is a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She is senior counsel at the Albright-Stonebridge Group and former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She serves on the boards of the International Crisis Group and the Atlantic Council, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Aspen Strategy Group. Ambassador Sherman led the U.S. negotiating team that reached agreement on a joint comprehensive plan of action between the P5+1, the European Union, and Iran, for which, among other diplomatic accomplishments, she was awarded the National Security Medal by President Barack Obama. Prior to her service in the Department of State, she was vice chair and founding partner of the Albright-Stonebridge Group, a counselor of the Department of State under Secretary Madeleine Albright, special advisor to President Clinton, and policy coordinator on North Korea, and Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs under Secretary Warren Christopher. She's been such an underachiever, my goodness. Ambassador Sherman, master's in social work, began her career as a director of child welfare for the state of Maryland. Later, she managed Senator Barbara Mulkowski's successful campaign for U.S. Senate, served as a director of Emily's List, and ran Campaign 88 at the Democratic National Committee for Dukakis' presidential campaign. She served on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, was chairman of the board of the directors of the fantastic Oxfam America nonprofit, and served on the U.S. Department of Defense Policy Board and Congressional Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism. All the while, Wendy Sherman has relied on values that have shaped her approach to work and leadership: authenticity, effective use of power and persistence, acceptance of change, and commitment to the team. She is a powerful voice for women, sponsoring women, and an ardent advocate for mentorship. In her book, Not for the Faint of Heart, she brings us inside the negotiating room to show how to put diplomatic values like courage, power, and persistence to work in our own lives. It is available for purchase today thanks to our partnership with the Palm Beach Bookstore, and Ambassador Sherman has generously agreed to stay with us after the event today for a book signing. So now, if I may tweak a line from a Foreign Policy magazine profile in 2013, I say, meet the social worker turned nuclear negotiator who tried to keep Iran from getting the bomb. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Wendy Sherman.
Well, it is just terrific to be here. Thank you very much, President Noble. Your work in philanthropy and neuroscience really helps us all. I said to President Noble, I would just like her to sort of mind meld with me. And then I could understand what our future is going to be like, because there's nothing as significant as neuroscience. So thank you for everything that you do. And thank you to the membership of the Forum Club. You are the largest nonpartisan political and public affairs organization in Florida, 43 years old. It's really astonishing. I walked into the room and I said, oh my goodness. It is really impressive. So thank you very much for being here today, and I'm really honored to join. And I want to say to the students who are at the back of the room, it won't be long before you're sitting at the front of the room. And everybody who is sitting in this room are phenomenal leaders and mentors and helpers and networkers. So when I'm done, besides coming to buy and get your book signed, please make sure you meet all these extraordinary people who can teach you things way beyond what I'm going to share with you today. So I'm really thrilled you're here, and I know you're going to ask the most challenging and difficult questions. So thank you. I want to take you all on a bit of a journey in these remarks today, as soon as I figure out what to do with this. Okay. And hope it gives you a sense of my own journey as well. September 2013, I was at my third United Nations General Assembly set of high-level meetings in New York, what we in national security circles call diplomatic speed dating. As Undersecretary for Political Affairs, responsible for every region of the world, along with all multilateral organizations, I spent about 10 days going from breakfast meetings through the day until late at night, joining the Secretary of State and holding meetings of my own. This particular session, however, would be historic. For some time, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United Kingdom, France, China, Russia, the United States, along with Germany and the European Union, had been trying to negotiate with Iran to ensure it would never get a nuclear weapon. Now, for the first time, all the foreign ministers would meet with the new Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, following the election of President Rouhani of Iran. More significantly, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry would be the first American secretary to meet with an Iranian foreign minister bilaterally since before the 1979 Iranian Revolution, when 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days. It was also the first time I would meet the men who would be my new counterparts, Abbas Araghchi and Majid Ravanchi. After 2 years of fairly fruitless multilateral negotiations with the previous Iranian administration under Ahmadinejad. As the multilateral ministerial meeting broke up after each minister had committed to productive negotiations going forward, John Kerry expertly guided Javad Zarif into a small meeting room off the side. That left me standing with Araghchi and Ravanchi, along with President Rouhani's brother, Hussein Faridun, nervously wondering what our ministers were saying to each other inside that room without any staff present. And it left me wondering how a social worker from Northwest Baltimore ended up negotiating with Iran, let alone Cuba, North Korea, the Middle East, while deeply engaged in national politics. Not for the faint of heart, Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence is a story of how I came to be in that room at the United Nations, how my unexpected life was built on a set of core values and skills that served me well in whatever setting I found myself. It all really began with a Rosh Hashanah sermon in September 1963. Baltimore Hebrew congregation on Park Heights Avenue in Baltimore was then led by Rabbi Morris Lieberman, and Lieberman had been one of 200 civil rights protesters, 6 of them clergy, to arrested at Gwynn Oak Park, an amusement park just across the city line that had refused entry to African Americans. For Lieberman, the protest, which did result in the integration of the park a few weeks later, was the latest in a series of civil rights actions in which he'd been in since helping to form the Clergymen's Interfaith Committee of Human Rights a few years earlier. But this was his first arrest, and he thought he owed his congregation an explanation. Lieberman reminded his congregation that as a chaplain in World War II, he had walked through the concentration camps at Dachau after the liberation. Those scenes had made him wonder what the Christian clergy had done as Jews were sent away. Lieberman wondered, what did they preach about on Christmas and Easter in those days? He then put the question to his congregants, could Jews stand back? Could Jews stand by as black citizens of Baltimore were systematically discriminated against? Lieberman used the Haggadah, which challenges Jews to regard himself or herself as though he or she in their own person had been a slave unto Pharaoh. For Lieberman, the way to do that in Baltimore in 1963 was to fight for the right of those who were still in slavery of discrimination and degradation. My father, a relatively prosperous residential real estate broker, was very moved by the sermon. After a few days, he went to see Lieberman to ask him what he could do. Lieberman said, "You're a real estate broker. You're more powerful than any rabbi. You can open up neighborhoods and make it possible for everybody to live wherever they want to live." He urged my father to advertise that all sales were open to any buyer of any race. My father was taken aback. He told Lieberman if he did that, he'd be run out of town. Lieberman looked at him, simply replied, "Well, you asked me what you could do." My parents discussed Lieberman's challenge, and even knowing they would likely face economic ruin, they decided to move forward. About a month later, Mal Sherman, Inc. announced that his company policy, he would sell to all individuals, regardless of race, creed, or color, as long as agents could find an owner who would sell. Within 6 months, he had lost more than 60% of his listings. Although he added other services to his company, by 1968, his office had closed. But my parents never questioned their choice. They taught me the first real ingredient of real change: courage, and the understanding that real change always comes with a price. But when it is the right thing to do, it is worth the cost. Presidents and secretaries of state with whom I've had the privilege of working for and with have shown such courage. Whether you support the Iran nuclear deal that was agreed in 2015, implemented in 2016, fully complied with in 2016 and 2017 and still today, but abandoned by President Trump in 2018, President Obama demonstrated courage. In his first inaugural address, he spoke direct to Iran. "We will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist." This was a 180-degree turn for the U.S. approach for almost a quarter of a century. The first U.S. sanctions had been applied in 1984 after the bombing of a U.S. Marines barrack in Lebanon, and had been broadened and tightened subsequently by both Republican and Democratic presidents. However, Obama understood that sanctions were useful in bringing a nation to the negotiating table, but rarely changed behavior itself. When the Europeans began negotiating with Iran in 2006, Iran had 164 spinning centrifuges, the mechanism needed to make the fissile material for a nuclear weapon. When the Obama administration got deeply engaged, Iran had 19,000. Using force against Iran had also been considered. In particular, bombing uranium enrichment sites at Natanz and Fordo, and the Arak, A-R-A-K, not I-R-A-Q, the Arak plutonium reactor under construction. Military strikes, however, wouldn't make Iran forget how to make bombs. Its nuclear program would be set back, but not ended, and even advocates for bombing put the delay at 3 to 5 years, and Iran would likely rebuild the facilities in secret and underground. But even given the limitations of alternatives, no previous president had dared to open talks with Iran. That took courage. To accomplish anything in life, particularly with an adversary, also requires forging common ground. The P5+1 of the European Union shared the common objective of ensuring Iran never obtain a nuclear weapon. Finding common ground with Iranians was far more difficult. Even simple things were barriers. For one thing, I couldn't shake hands with my Iranian counterparts. Conservative Muslims in many cultures are forbidden from physical contact with members of the opposite sex, however incidental. In Iran, men and women sit separately on buses and in university classrooms. Those rules don't evaporate when engaging in diplomacy. Those of us who are barred from shaking hands have developed a workaround, placing our right hands to our chest and giving a slight nod. It works. But when you are the only woman in a room full of men, you often risk looking like stuck in a Marx Brothers routine. In an effort to find common ground one day during a break, I turned the conversation with Arachi and Ravanchi toward our inability to shake hands. I explained I'd grown up in a neighborhood in Baltimore with many who were strictly observant Orthodox Jews. just as in their culture, the Orthodox, I explained, do not touch any woman who is not her spouse, child, or parent. Although they were slightly mortified by this discussion, they were also fascinated. They'd never known of this. No wonder, since fewer than 10,000 Jews are supposed to live in Iran. One of them, they told me, was a member of their parliament. More than ironic, given Iran denials of the Holocaust and the desire to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Obviously, finding such common ground does not solve a nuclear standoff, but it does help to open the door a small crack. Not for the faint of heart chronicles other times of finding common ground, even with the Russians. Particularly difficult these days as they try to undermine our democratic institutions and sow division in our country. Of course, that particular battle is all about power. Exercising power comes in all forms, but understanding power and making good use of it is crucial in diplomacy and in life. People often ask me what it's like to be the only woman at a negotiating table. I tell them that my friend, colleague, and one-time boss, Madeleine Albright, who's also spoken here, told me that the trick is not simply to wield your personal power, but to own the power of your office or role. Who, after all, can measure up to the outside might of America? When you sit across the negotiating table, Madeleine told me, you are the United States of America, not Wendy. If you know that and use it, it matters more than the fact you are a woman. Owning your power in whatever role, mother, father, grandmother, manager, president, commissioner, is critical to getting your interests met. Whether a boss or a parent, being firm but respectful to results. Supporting, but also demanding support from a spouse and working together can be quite powerful. Former Senator Barbara Mikulski, whose first successful Senate campaign I mentioned, showed me another way of owning my own power. Barbara, only 4 feet 11 inches tall and comfortably round, doesn't just assume a role, she inhabits it. When competitors said she didn't look or act like a senator, Mikulski showed them that, quote, this was what the part looks like, and this is what the part is going to look like. Her authenticity, her willingness to be who she was, made real the phrase, make the personal political. Women in particular have a somewhat strange relationship with the conventional use of power. We're not exactly afraid of it, but we often seem more comfortable with informal rather than institutional power. Early in my career as a social student, I did a study of community organizations. Most often the organizations were started by women to get at light, school crossing, or safe drinking water in a community. But as soon as advocacy developed into an organization, complete with donors and grants, men invariably stepped in. Women often built the organization that men came to run. No time has my own confidence in my own power been challenged as it was during the Iran negotiation. In October 2014, I boarded a plane to Brussels for what was supposed to be a routine prep session for the next negotiating round with the Iranians. 2 weeks hence in Geneva. Although I have a usual routine to sleep on planes, an express meal, a glass or two of red wine, a blanket over my head, and a meditation of myself in a kayak on a lake in the Berkshires, this leap was going to be a lot tougher. More than a year after President Obama green-lighted secret negotiations with Iran, I was charged with telling my colleagues about those secret negotiations and the draft agreement still bracketed that had been achieved. Most surprising to my colleagues, beyond the secrecy, would be the provision that would possibly permit Iran to pursue very limited enrichment of uranium, consistent with peaceful uses, if they would allow very intrusive monitoring and evaluation. My colleagues would disagree with this stance, but the United States had argued me most vociferously that the Iranians shouldn't be allowed any enrichment. President Obama had opened the door to resolution by understanding that Iran could not unlearn what it knew. The politics were trickier than they looked. My news would force my partners to confront what they suspected already. Positioned in between the United States and Iran, they had unequal status. My negotiating partners could stop efforts, but no deal could be made without the United States. No other country had the power, bench, military to back up, or the economic leverage to move forward. I had the burden of representing that power. Working with our partners, we magnified that power, but he left President Rouhani with enough authority, enough power to carry out the deal. The trick, as always, was to use power without depriving everyone else of theirs. As both exhilarating and exhausting as the exercise of power, one also has to know when you have to let go as well. In my own life, I've had to confront the reality that I can help my younger brother took his own life at age 25. Every family, every life has tragedies, death or divorce, or changed circumstances that have no control and trample the future. In diplomacy, we always have to be prepared to accept our lack of control circumstances. The Middle East, of course, is a ready example. No diplomatic effort has seen as many failures, so many unscripted roadblocks and seeming dead ends as the quest for peace in the Middle East. Nonetheless, every single American president seems to enter office sure that the success that has eluded others can be yet had. When I began at the State Department as Secretary of Legislative Affairs in the first months of the Clinton administration, the mood was cautiously upbeat. Secret negotiations had been going on in Oslo, Norway, since Clinton had begun office. And before he had time to put his own ideas on the table, President Clinton stood beside Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin on the White House lawn, gently prodding the two to shake hands on the peace agreement they had just signed based on the Oslo Accords. This land peace swap, known as the Declaration of Principles and Interim Self-Government Arrangements, we diplomats always do terrible titles, was less a true settlement than a hopeful beginning. The bright blue sky that day couldn't foretell the painful path of ostensibly confidence-building steps that were meant to end in a final status agreement. But progress was excruciatingly slow, and both Arafat and Rabin faced increasing dissent. On November 4th, 1995, Prime Minister Rabin, speaking at a peace rally in Kings of Israel Square in Tel Aviv, was assassinated by a 25-year-old Israeli man, a radical right-winger who was opposed to peace, and in particular the withdrawal from the West Bank. Rabin's assassination was devastating. Not only was he Israel's leader, but he was a chief pillar of support for Arafat as well. Rabin's funeral 2 days later to allow for dignitaries' travel was something of a funeral for Oslo also. Ironically, perhaps, it prompted the first visit to Israel for President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, the first public trip to Israel for King Hussein of Jordan, and a rare abroad for the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms. As state's liaison to Congress, I had the privilege of escorting members to the funeral on an overnight military flight. We hardly had time to absorb the tragedy, and the feelings on display were raw. Emotional speeches by President Clinton and King Hussein of Jordan were more than matched by Rabin's granddaughter. Afterwards, the dignitaries headed to the King David Hotel for Shiva. As we approached the hotel's patio overlooking the city wall of Jerusalem, where all of Jewish history seems written, we came upon King Hussein, sitting alone, clearly contemplating all that had been before, the assassination of his father by an Arab, the half-century of hope and strife since, and now Rabin's murder by a citizen of his own country. I've never been used to standing except with you next to me, Hussein had said at the funeral addressing Rabin, speaking about peace, speaking about our hopes, and dreams of generations to come. In the months following, Clinton worked hard to honor Rabin's ambition, convening parties at Wye River and Camp David in the summer of 2000, and twice more before the end of his presidency. But Arafat could not get to yes, despite promising Clinton he would do so. An Israeli election that was in part a referendum on the peace process elected Ariel Sharon, hardline. Peace in the Middle East, for a very long time, has been lost. Having chosen to pursue Middle East peace, combined with the reality of a contentious presidential election that didn't get over until a December Supreme Court decision, meant that the historic trip I took with then Secretary Madeleine Albright in October 2000 to Pyongyang, North Korea, to secure a moratorium on missile tests never came to closure. I went with Albright on her last trip as Secretary of State to Africa, carrying 2 suitcases, one for the hot weather and another with cold weather clothes, if dispatched by the president to North Korea, carrying a date for a presidential visit if Kim Jong-il, the leader, agreed to final terms of a deal. I never got to make that trip as a result of the circumstances. His then brought us to the tough place we are today, a North Korea with nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. Letting go of what you cannot change is a challenge to all of us in our lives, personal and professional. Certainly the 2016 election was a very painful time of letting go, for me, of the first woman president of the United States. There have been many days since I have wanted to pack up and lean out. But I know we must learn from our experiences, use that knowledge as inspiration, and get up and try again. It helps to try again when you have a team working with you. I always have a support group and a cohesive team for whatever I have done in life. The core negotiating team for the Iran deal were 15 hardy souls backed up by literally hundreds in the US government. In forming a team, I've always tried to ensure that I had all the expertise I needed, that we was one, and that we valued each team member for what they brought to the table. Indeed, early in the Iran process, I asked the team to write an entire agreement, complete with annexes, over 100 pages. I knew we wouldn't get this ideal agreement, but we needed to know what we were aiming for. We then all sat together for 2 days in a secure conference room going over the agreement line by line. We each needed to understand the language or change it. We each needed to understand our own limits and learn to rely on others. Any team has to be focused, disciplined, and able to persist through hard times, never losing sight of the objective. Persistence is not the same as patience. Though a negotiator is often required to reset calmly and keep going, there are times when well-placed anger is called for. Many times during the Iran negotiations, Secretary Kerry and I were ready to tell the president that the objective could not be reached, just as we confronted the Iranians numerous times about whether they were really serious about what was necessary. And other times we needed to persist in the face of criticisms and threats. Indeed, at one point, protesters on the streets of Tehran marched shouting death to Wendy Sherman. Similarly, a series of strange emails showed up my and my daughter's Gmail accounts saying my husband was having an affair in Europe while I was negotiating. He wants me to make sure I say he wasn't. Both of these times were challenging, but ultimately increased my resolve to work on behalf of America's security needs. And of course, American politics were in play as well. But we persisted nonetheless. Through my broken nose, Secretary Kerry's femur, broken femur, and many illnesses, missed family events, and too many air miles and hotel rooms littered with hand-washed clothing. We persisted because we believed that Iran having a nuclear weapon would be disastrous for the Middle East, for the world, and for America's security. When we finally reached the end, success, it was as if we'd never got past the beginning. I spent the last minutes of the Iran talks waiting quietly in a small hotel meeting room while down the hall, the Iranian foreign minister held out for one more compromise with John Kerry. Monday, June 13th, was day 26 for me at the Coburg. In the 27 days I was there, I had one meal outside the hotel. There had been plenty of last-minute drama, but finally, a deal was done. Late in the evening, followed by an all-nighter to ensure the language in the agreement was exactly what it needed to be. Success doesn't always immediately feel like success. My adrenaline, set to urgent for so long, slowly drops, and a sort of depression sets in as I deflate. Besides, in the case of the Iran deal, we had to get through the congressional review process. A vote agreed between the White House and Congress, so Congress could have a say. It's important, then, to know what the mark of success is. In the case of Iran, it was to keep Iran from ever getting the bomb. That objective was met, although we now know that President Trump has left the deal arguing that it didn't cover all of Iran's malign behavior. In fact, it did not purposely. If we tried to resolve everything, Iran's nuclear program would have become just another element to be bartered for other activities we would try to thwart. Getting the nuclear bomb off the table took away Iran's greatest leverage, allowing us to focus on their other activities without them possessing a nuclear deterrence. Nonetheless, June 14th, Bastille Day, was an extraordinary moment. In the early morning hours, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was announced to the press. Diplomacy rarely, as we have seen, has a final success. Campaign victories, like Barbara Mikulski's Senate victory and Hillary Clinton's primary victory, are almost unadulterated joy. Though, as Barbara once quipped, mine 25-year overnight success. Diplomatic achievements are often overrun by events, undermined or declared invalid years later. Even the peace of World War I, the war to end all wars, was followed a mere 20 years later by World War II. On May 8, 2018, Donald Trump did withdraw the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I happened to be in Valletta, Malta, when the announcement was made. As I walked those cobblestone streets, my cell phone rang. It was John Kerry. We shared our frustration and our deep concern for the country, ending the call by encouraging each other to keep up the fight. You may ask, why? Why continue to try to argue and debate and push for peace? My life, all of our lives, must persist in repairing the world. No more so than in difficult, seemingly impossible times when we're pulled to retreat rather than to engage. I end these remarks where I began, with the call to my parents to engage, even at great cost, to do the right thing. That commitment is part of my inheritance, to continue to fight for what's right, to argue, to debate, to listen, and to push for peace. Thank you.
So you may stay at the
great.
podium. If you have any questions prepared for Ambassador Sherman, please hold them in the air and our volunteers will bring them forward. Ambassador Sherman, today's questions come from the audience directly. And it's an opportunity for citizen leaders to hear news and information directly from the source, unfiltered. To kick off our Q&A, we always go to our first two student questions. So afterwards, we will do the questions submitted by the audience. If the first student from Palm Beach Atlantic University will please stand, introduce yourself, and ask the question.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Sherman. My name is Logan Edwards. Before we get to the question, on behalf of Palm Beach Atlantic University, we'd just like to thank you for being here. It's very much appreciated. And we do have a question prepared. So when you negotiate with representatives of other nations, such as in the Iran nuclear agreement, how much of that is scripted and how much is spontaneous?
It's a really good question. People do it differently, and we certainly see a difference in the current administration. So I can only say what happened in the Obama and the Clinton administrations. It's a way. Whether it works or not is another issue, but it's a way. We had a very deliberate and complex policy process. One of the things I've said to some of the envoys now working for President Trump, many of whom I know quite well and have respect for, I always knew that the President of the United States would have my back because we had a policy process where we agreed on the right and left margins, we agreed on the broad outlines of how we were going to proceed. We would come back at each point in the negotiation for discussions. Negotiations are very little in some ways about what happens in the room. I often say to people, I negotiated inside the administration. I negotiated with each one of the P5+1 bilaterally and as a group. I negotiated with the United States Congress. I negotiated with think tanks and advocacy groups. I negotiated with Israel constantly. I talked to them before and after each negotiating round, usually in secure video conferences, or I'd travel there, they'd come here. I negotiated with the Gulf Arab states, meeting before and after each round. I negotiated with any other country that had concern, because countries like Korea and Japan had imported, and India had imported huge amounts of oil from Iran. We had to have them reduce that significantly. And then, yes, occasionally I negotiated with Iran. It is a very complicated, labor-intensive process, and at each point along the way, we had internal meetings at a small group, and then we had very formal deputies committee meetings and very formal National Security Council meetings where the president would come, would listen to what we had suggested. He had gotten a memo in advance, and he would then say, here are my decisions. And then I would know what I needed to do, or Secretary Kerry would know what he needed to do in the next round of the negotiations. Very deliberative process. All of that said, you have to be very flexible. Nothing ever goes the way you script it to go. It's like the generals say, the plan is only good until first movement, and then you have to create a new one because things don't happen as they ought to. I'll say one more thing about this so I don't go on forever. There was a point in the negotiation we were really stuck because the Iranians didn't want to put anything on paper. Because if they put it on paper, they'd have to send it back, and then they would be constrained in what they could do in the negotiations. We understood that. We didn't want them to be constrained. We wanted them to be as open as possible to see what possibilities there were. So it occurred to me there was a way around this, and I asked my team to find me an enormous rolling whiteboard, very low tech. I'm a huge believer in low tech. I love technology, but I like low tech too. We brought a whiteboard. I put on the whiteboard every element of the deal that we needed to agree. And we sat there, and each of us talked about where we were on those elements. Everybody took copious notes, of course. Nothing was formal. But we then knew where each of us stood, and then we could erase the whiteboard. So it didn't exist.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Sure.
And if the second student will please rise, introduce yourself, and ask the question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Chloe Gannon from Cardinal Newman High School. Given your background in international development, how would you make the case for international engagement or aid, skeptic of the U.S. foreign aid budget?
Great question. Most Americans think that 40% of our GDP goes to foreign assistance. Less than 1% goes to foreign assistance. So first I'd start with facts. They're very useful things occasionally. Second, foreign aid is really a terrible name, quite frankly, and over the years we've tried to think of other names because it's really assistance in our national security interest. And let me give you an example that's very current. We are all very engaged in the debate and discussion over how to deal with immigration in our country, a country that is made of immigrants. When the president spoke last night, the pictures behind him were of his mother and father, and they were immigrants. So one from Germany, one from Scotland. So we're a nation of immigrants, but we're having a real challenge because things are changing very rapidly. You here in Florida understand that very well, and it makes people very anxious. They don't know what the future is going to look like or what their place is in that future. If we had a really well thought out and well executed effort in Central America, we wouldn't solve the whole problem, for sure. We need comprehensive immigration reform, but we would solve a big piece of the problem. People would feel like they had to leave those countries for their lives. Mothers come with their children because they don't want their kids dragooned into gangs. They come because they don't want their children killed. They can't move from one neighbor to the other because they're just moving from one gang to another gang. People don't make that arduous journey just because we're the bright, shiny object. So foreign assistance and foreign aid is not about just our wonderful humanitarian image. We're a very giving nation. Many in this room are philanthropists, or just in whatever little way you can, united way, all of the ways in which we are very generous people. So I'm all for that kind of assistance, but at the end of the day, you have to have a concerted effort. In the case of Central America, we had a terrific plan for Colombia, which was the center of drug trafficking in the world for years. Not a safe place to go. We spent an enormous amount of money. I think it was $800 million, $900 million at the time, which was still a lot of money, but then was a tremendous amount of money. We solved a lot of the problem in Colombia, which led to the peace agreement with the FARC in the last few years. But what we didn't do is keep going, because then the drug trafficking moved up to Central America and to Cuba to some extent. So we have to help people understand we do these things for our interests, firstly. Thank you for your question.
China's Belt and Road Initiative leaving many developed nations heavily indebted to China. What do you believe the repercussions will be when China forecloses on those debts?
China is, without a doubt, one of the greatest challenges to our country. Not only in the Belt and Road Initiative, which could economically control that part of the world, but what they're doing in South China Sea by taking rocks and islands and creating military bases, by their technology around 5G and artificial intelligence. China's done some amazing things. They've reduced poverty by probably now 35%, which is extraordinary. They've done some extraordinary things, but their way of being in the world is to, in fact, make loans ensure that all the work is done by Chinese workers. This was their way of operating in Africa, and over time has made Africans most unhappy with China because they feel like they don't transfer any of their help to indigenous people, to Africans themselves, and because the loans become really an albatross around the neck of these countries. I think that one of the reasons why I wish we had a broader strategy towards China, it's not that I don't agree with the president. I agree with the president that economically China is not playing fair. I wouldn't approach that problem in the way he's approaching that problem. I think it's too narrow, and I think it's too short-sighted, and it's putting a tax on American consumers. But nonetheless, if we had a broader strategy with China, which countries like Vietnam and Cambodia very much want us to have, they want us to help be a hedge against China's dominance in the region and ultimately in the world. So I wish we had a broader strategy. I think China's going to pay a price for how it's doing Belt and Road and how it's doing financing. But I do think probably the Obama administration should have joined the Asian Infrastructure Bank. We chose not to because we were worried about what the rules would be. But I think that was probably a missed opportunity for us having a voice in what happens.
Thank you. Did Iraq invade Kuwait because Kuwait was cross-drilling into Iraq's oil fields? And did Iraq subsequently receive the green light from the U.S. ambassador to Iraq?
Oh my, it's a very complicated history. You know, I don't know the absolute truth of all of that. It's the thing about history. There is no question that this had to do with resources and had to do with oil. It was at a different point of time. Oil is less of an issue, certainly for the United States, than it was then. And because we don't believe that other countries should go around invading and taking over other countries. Why Russia's illegally annexing Crimea is a big problem, and having little men on the eastern border of Ukraine. So I think the decision made by George H.W. Bush to help and to stop that invasion was accurate. In hindsight, even though there was a lot of criticism at the time, he was probably right not to go further at the time and into Iraq and take out Saddam Hussein. It would have started us earlier on the long journey we've been on for Iraq to be a different kind of a country. So I think we are where we are now. We are in a better place with Iraq. I'm glad, quite frankly, that Secretary Pompeo just made a surprise visit to Iraq, because when the president went to see our troops at one of our bases, he really offended the leadership of Iraq by not visiting with them. So I'm very glad Secretary Pompeo went to try to fix that problem, made a huge investment of our lives and treasure in Iraq, and it's important to see it through, and I think we are getting to the right place. And I, like most people in this country, hope that we are able to remove our troops from Afghanistan, from Syria, from Iraq, except whatever small amount we need to keep there for all kinds of interesting purposes. But we have to do it in the right way so it's sustainable and durable, and that's I'm concerned about how things are proceeding.
Thank you. Have the Palestinian people been abandoned in the Arab world?
That is a great question. I think that there are forces that are trying to make it appear as if the Arab countries have abandoned the Palestinians and will sell out for the fight against Iran and for peace with Israel. I don't think it's nearly as far along as it is portrayed. The Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, are still provide support to the Palestinians. I don't think in the end they would agree to a peace deal that sells out the Palestinians. You know, one of the reasons that I agreed to become the Director of Center for Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School is because we have a huge deficit in leadership, not just in our country, but around the world. And there are tremendous leaders at the local level in our country. But we need to grow leaders in every sector of our society. And around the world, we have a great problem. I would say that neither Prime Minister Netanyahu nor President Abbas are really committed to peace at the moment. And it is very hard to get there without leaders who want to do the hard work necessary.
Thank you. So a little change of topic. Palm Beach County is facing a workforce housing issue.
Who is
Palm Beach County, where we
Palm
are
Beach
here.
County.
In 1996, you were interviewed about the national housing policy. Then the housing picture, so this is back in 1996, was not a happy one. Especially for low-income individuals, it was virtually invisible on the political scene, on the presidential and congressional candidates as well. It's 22 years later. Has housing gained any more prominence in federal policy terms?
I think by way of the question being asked, the answer is probably no. You know, I was listening last night to some of the commentary, and even though, like many of you, I like to have a holiday from TV from time and again because I do MSNBC, I pay attention to all of this, and one of the downsides of the shutdown is that people who are in Section 8 housing, which is the federal housing support provided to a lot of low-income and poor people, they're not getting those payments. The landlords aren't getting those payments, and the follow-on to all of that is a true nightmare. So things may indeed get worse before they get better. The shutdown goes on for much longer. You know, Palm Beach County, looking around here, and I was joking, sort of joking, because I'm not sure why I'm getting back on an airplane to go to Cambridge, Massachusetts. When I left, it was 18 degrees. Snow was on the ground. I don't know. Anyway, but looking around at Palm Beach County, this is an incredibly wealthy county, and I have spent a lot of my life living in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is also a very wealthy county in Maryland, and finding low-income housing is very difficult, and it means great use housing, residential and commercial, and doing some creative things to change things. And that takes leadership from commissioners, from local elected officials, because NIMBY, not in my backyard, is a perpetual problem to solve these things. So we've got a long way to go. And I have heard a lot from Secretary Carson. And I revere Secretary Carson as a children's doctor. He was a god, and I think he should continue that illustrative career.
So, last question. Remember, Ambassador Sherman's book will be for sale in the lobby, and she will be graciously staying with us. So the pins that Madeleine Albright wears all have a significant purpose. Is there any such meaning to the pin that you are wearing today?
This pin was actually, I didn't do it for the significance, I love the pin, but this pin was given to me by Clinton. When she was going to become Secretary of State, I led the transition effort at the State Department to help her get ready. So thank you for doing that. I was in the private sector then, took a leave from Albright Stonebridge Group to help her do this. She gave this pin, and I love it. It's designed by a woman named Ann Hand, who makes tons of pins in Washington and makes for every presidential campaign, every significant thing. And she has an eagle pin you'll see on many members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, independents. It's a gold eagle pin with a little pearl ball at the end of it, very popular. But I guess when I thought about coming here and wearing this, I wanted to signify more than anything, we are one country. We are made up of lots of different voices and lots of points of view, and one of the things I hope I can do at Harvard is bring Harvard out to the rest of the country so we can listen to each other and hear each other and find solutions together. We are a great country. I believe we are a tremendously resilient country. We are entrepreneurial and filled with hope and possibility. We have been the beacon of hope and freedom for the world. And I believe in us, and I think I probably will say today, I hope you do too. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us. Stay tuned for news at our February event. But please join us in the lobby for signing. And thank you again. Happy New Year, everyone.